Now I'd like to continue our discussion of the versions. Another Greek version is Symmachus. Symmachus dates to the 2nd century AD, and it was the 4th column of Origen's hexapla that we'll mention very shortly. Traditions vary as to whether Symmachus was an Ebionite, which is a Christian sect, so Eusebius and Jerome say, or whether he was a Samaritan convert to Judaism, as another source says. But anyway, Symmachus's version was less widely distributed than either Aquila or Theodotion. And that brings us to the hexapla. The hexapla was put together by the early church father Origen, who died around 254. And basically he came up with a parallel Bible Old Testament in 6 columns with the Hebrew Bible, its transliteration into Greek, and then 4 Greek versions. And the original hexapla was about 6,500 pages, a very massive work of scholarship, though unfortunately it only survives in fragments. We have part of the Pentateuch and the historical books in manuscript G and manuscript M. And we have the prophets and yet another manuscript, and then the 150 verses of the Psalms and the Milan fragments, and works in Syriac and Armenian quote and or translate portions as well. The way that it worked was this. You had, in the first column, you'd have the Hebrew text. In the second column, you would transliterate the Hebrew into Greek. And then in the third column, you'd have Aquila's translation. Fourth column, you would have Symmachus's translation. In the fifth column, you would have the Septuagint translation. And then in the sixth column, you would have Theodotion's translation, all in parallel with each other. Let me move on from Greek versions to Aramaic versions. The first Aramaic version is a Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, known as the Aramaic Targums. The Aramaic Targums began in the years BC, though continued to be revised into the Christian era. And the Aramaic Targums tend to have a considerable amount of paraphrase. You'll find it in the Rabbinic Bible, where right next to the Hebrew text you'll have the Aramaic paraphrase. One can speak of 2 different categories of Aramaic Targums. You have the Old Palestinian Targums, which are the oldest Targum fragments. These were not the official Targums that were later adopted in Judaism, but were early attempts to translate into Aramaic, the Old Testament. But then in the Rabbinic Bible, you have the official Targums, the Targum of Jonathan, which is mostly the prophets, and the Targum Onkelos, which is the Pentateuch. Another Aramaic translation is the Syriac Bible. It's a translation of the Old Testament and the New Testament into Christian Aramaic, which is Syriac. It was in Syria. Goes back to the early centuries of the Christian era. The standardized version of the Syriac Old Testament came to be called the Peshitta. Another early version is the Latin Vulgate. It was a translation of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament into Latin. It was carried out by the Roman Catholic scholar Jerome around AD 400. And this translation by Jerome became the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, and it indeed has influenced even our English Bibles, because the scholars who translated the English knew their Latin rather well. Now, how is it that one can use any of this for textual criticism purposes? An attempt to do so was proposed by William F. Albright and refined a bit by his student Frank Cross. And he tries to divide the different versions and traditions into families, the way that you do in New Testament textual criticism. The idea is this: that you had the original Hebrew text, we'll call that the Ur text, but that was taken in the Babylonian exile to Babylon, and thus the manuscripts there came to be what might be called a Babylonian recension. That was then preserved and became eventually the Masoretic text. Now, related to this Proto-Masoretic tradition are some of the early versions. The Syriac translation is based on what we might call a Proto-Masoretic text, a version of the Hebrew text that existed before the Masoretes came along. Although it is also influenced by the Septuagint and by the Old Palestinian Targums. The Targums were also based on a Proto-Masoretic text. The Latin Vulgate is also based on a Proto-Masoretic text. Now, moving to the other tradition, the Palestinian texts. These are texts that stayed in Palestine, did not go into the Babylonian exile. Now, one branch of that would be the texts that were brought to Egypt. So with the Babylonian exile, certain Jews fled to Egypt, and they brought their Bibles with them. And their copies of the Bible became what one might call the Egyptian recension of the text. And it was among those Egyptian recensions of the text that the Septuagint translators got their manuscripts, from which they made their early Greek translation, the Septuagint. Similarly, the other Greek versions, Lucian, Aquila, Theodotion, some old Latin translations, and again, Origen's Hexapla, which includes some of these, was basically an Egyptian recension of the text. Another text that stayed in Palestine was a Palestinian recension, which eventually becomes the Samaritan Pentateuch recension of the text. So again, it was based on a text that stayed in Palestine, and it was preserved ultimately among the Samaritans, who used that as the basis of their text. So anyway, that's William F. Albright's local recension theory, which allows you to do some textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible based on basically manuscript schools and families. We will finish our discussion of the text of the Old Testament and textual criticism in the next video.